Jamal couldn't believe his eyes. The massive black SUV parked outside his small house wasn't just any car. It had tinted windows, shiny rims, and the unmistakable sleekness of wealth. His heart raced as two men in suits stepped out, their faces expressionless. One of them knocked on the front door. Jamal's mom, her hands still wet from washing dishes, cautiously opened it. "Is this the home of Jamal Carter?" the man asked in a deep, serious voice. Jamal, standing behind his mom, felt his legs wobble. He slowly raised his hand. "That's me?" The man nodded and pulled out a gold-embossed envelope from his jacket. "This is for you," he said, handing it to Jamal. "Mr. Howard sends his regards." Before Jamal could ask who Mr. Howard was, the men got back into the SUV. The vehicle pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust and 1,000 questions behind. Jamal stared at the envelope, his fingers trembling as he opened it. His eyes widened, and his mouth dropped open as he read the first few words. It all started yesterday. Jamal was a 14-year-old boy who lived in a rundown neighborhood on the edge of town. Life wasn't easy, but Jamal didn't complain. He helped his mom with chores, walked his younger sister, Mia, to school, and did odd jobs around the neighborhood to make some extra cash. Yesterday morning, Jamal was riding his bike home from the grocery store when he spotted a shiny, expensive car on the side of the road. It had a flat tire, and standing next to it was a well-dressed man pacing back and forth, looking frustrated. Jamal hesitated for a moment, then decided to help. "Excuse me, sir," Jamal called out, hopping off his bike. "Do you need help?" The man, who looked to be in his late 40s, turned around, clearly surprised. He had sharp features, silver hair, and wore a tailored suit that screamed wealth. He looked Jamal up and down before replying, "I don't think you can help with this, kid." "I know how to change a tire," Jamal insisted. "My uncle taught me." The man sighed and gestured to the car. "Be my guest." Jamal set his grocery bag aside, grabbed the spare tire from the trunk, and got to work. He noticed the man checking his phone, clearly in a hurry. "You got somewhere important to be?" Jamal asked, trying to make conversation. The man gave a small laugh. "Yeah, kid. I'm supposed to be at a meeting that could make or break my company." Jamal worked quickly, tightening the last bolt on the spare tire. "All done?" he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. The man looked genuinely impressed. "You got skills. What's your name?" "Jamal," he said, a bit shyly. "Well, Jamal, I'm Robert Howard," the man said, extending his hand. Jamal shook it, feeling the firm grip of someone used to closing deals. "Thank you for your help. You might have just saved my day." Jamal grinned. "Glad I could help." Mr. Howard reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Here, take this." Jamal's eyes widened. "Whoa, that's too much." "Nonsense," Mr. Howard said, pushing the bill into Jamal's hand. "You earned it." Jamal thanked him, feeling like he was on top of the world as he rode his bike home. He told his mom about the encounter, and they both marveled at how one good deed could lead to such a reward. But Jamal had no idea that this small act of kindness was just the beginning. The next day, when the black SUV showed up at his house, it was clear that Mr. Howard wasn't done with him yet. But why? What could a millionaire possibly want with a kid like Jamal? Just as Jamal's mind raced with possibilities, he looked back down at the letter in his hands. His heart pounded as he read the final line, "Pack your bags. You're coming with us." Jamal's head spun as he read those words over and over. "Pack your bags. You're coming with us." What did that even mean? He glanced up at his mom, who looked just as stunned. "What is this about, Jamal?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Who are these people?" "I don't know, Mom," Jamal said, still gripping the letter tightly. "I'd only help the guy change his tire." His mom took the letter and read it, her frown deepening. "I don't like this," she muttered, shaking her head. "What does a rich man want with my son?" Before Jamal could respond, Mia ran into the room, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Jamal, are they taking you away?" she asked, her wide eyes brimming with tears. No, Jamal said, kneeling down to hug his little sister. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll figure this out." But his mom wasn't so sure. "We need to call someone," she said, her voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right." Jamal nodded, but inside, curiosity gnawed at him. Who was Mr. Howard? Why was he so interested in Jamal after such a brief encounter? And what would happen if he didn't go? Later that evening, Jamal sat on his bed, staring at the $100 bill Mr. Howard had given him. It was still hard to believe that someone like him, just a kid from the projects, had crossed paths with a millionaire. But now it felt like he was in over his head. His mom made a few phone calls, trying to get advice from family and friends. Most of them said the same thing: don't trust it. It could be a scam. But deep down, Jamal didn't think Mr. Howard was a bad guy. If anything, he seemed genuine, even grateful. The next morning, just as Jamal was about to head out for school, another knock came at the door. His mom froze, her hand hovering over the sink. Jamal hurried to the door and opened it cautiously. There they were again, the same two men in suits. One of them spoke. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. We're here to escort Jamal. Mr. Howard is expecting him." "Expecting him for what?" his mom demanded, stepping forward protectively. "You can't just show up and take my son without explaining what's going on." The man remained calm. "Mr. Howard has a proposition for Jamal. He believes Jamal has potential and wants to offer him an opportunity that could change his life." Jamal's mom crossed her arms. "And what kind of opportunity are we talking about?" "I'm afraid Mr. Howard would prefer to discuss that in person," the man replied smoothly. "We can assure you that Jamal will be safe and well cared for." Jamal could feel his mom's hesitation. She wasn't the kind to trust strangers, especially ones driving fancy cars and wearing expensive suits. But before she could respond, Jamal spoke up. "I want to hear what he has to say." His mom shot him a worried look. "Jamal." "I'll be fine, Mom," Jamal said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "If it's something weird, I'll come right back. I promise." After a tense silence, his mom finally nodded. "All right," she said reluctantly. "But you call me the second something feels off, you hear?" "I will," Jamal promised. The men stepped aside to let Jamal climb into the SUV. The leather seats were cool and soft, unlike anything he'd ever felt. As the car pulled away, Jamal watched his house get smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. The ride was quiet, except for the hum of the engine. Jamal couldn't help but wonder where they were going. After about 20 minutes, the SUV turned into a long driveway that led to a massive estate. The house was huge, with tall white pillars and perfectly manicured lawns. Jamal's mouth dropped open. "This is where Mr. Howard lives?" he asked, unable to hide his amazement. "Yes," one of the men replied. "He's waiting for you inside." The car came to a stop, and Jamal was escorted to the front door. A butler opened it, leading him into a grand foyer with a chandelier that sparkled like 1,000 diamonds. Jamal felt like he had stepped into a whole different world. Mr. Howard appeared at the top of a grand staircase, wearing a casual sweater and slacks this time. He descended the stairs with a warm smile. "Jamal, I'm glad you came." Jamal nodded, still feeling a bit out of place. "You said you had an opportunity for me?" "I do," Mr. Howard said, motioning for Jamal to follow him into a cozy sitting room. They both sat down, and Mr. Howard leaned forward. "Jamal, yesterday you did something most people wouldn't. You stopped to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. That says a lot about your character." "Thanks, I guess," Jamal said, unsure where this was going. Mr. Howard smiled. "I'm always looking for people with potential. People who deserve a chance to make something of themselves. That's why I want to help you." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Help me how?" "I want to fund your education," Mr. Howard said. "Private school, college, whatever it takes to set you up for a successful future." Jamal's jaw dropped. "Are you serious?" "Completely," Mr. Howard said. "You have the drive, Jamal. I see it in you. All you need is the right opportunity." Jamal couldn't believe what he was hearing. It sounded too good to be true. "Why me?" he asked. "There are lots of other kids who need help." Mr. Howard's smile faded slightly. "Because I've been where you are, Jamal. I grew up in a tough neighborhood too. Someone gave me a chance once, and it changed my life. Now, I want to do the same for you." Jamal's mind raced. This was the kind of opportunity people dreamed of. But before he could say anything else, the butler entered the room, looking anxious. He whispered something into Mr. Howard's ear, and Mr. Howard's expression darkened. "I'm sorry, Jamal," he said, standing up abruptly. "Something urgent has come up. We'll continue this conversation later." Jamal stood too, his heart pounding. "Is everything okay?" Mr. Howard didn't answer. He nodded to the butler, who escorted Jamal back to the SUV. As the car pulled away, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something big was happening. Something Mr. Howard wasn't telling him. The ride home was tense. Jamal's thoughts raced, bouncing between the incredible offer Mr. Howard had made and the mysterious urgency that had cut their meeting short. The two men in suits didn't speak, leaving Jamal alone with his swirling thoughts. When they finally pulled up in front of his house, Jamal stepped out, his mind still buzzing. As he walked up the driveway, his mom opened the door, worry etched across her face. "What happened?" "What do they want?" she asked, pulling him inside before he could answer. Jamal sat at the kitchen table, explaining everything: the offer for a better education, Mr. Howard's promise, and the sudden interruption. His mom listened, her face a mixture of relief and suspicion. "He wants to pay for your school?" she asked, her arms crossed. "Yeah," Jamal said. "He said he sees potential in me." His mom shook her head slowly. "I don't know, Jamal. Rich people don't just give away money for nothing. There's got to be a catch." Jamal frowned. "It didn't feel like that, Mom. He said someone helped him when he was young, and now he wants to do the same for me." She sighed, sitting down beside him. "I want to believe that, baby, I do. But we gotta be careful. The world doesn't always work in our favor." Jamal nodded, understanding her hesitation. Life had taught them both to be cautious. Still, a part of him wanted to trust Mr. Howard. The man had seemed genuine, and his offer felt like a rare chance to escape the struggles of their daily life. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Jamal tried to focus on his homework, but his mind kept drifting back to the mansion, the butler, and Mr. Howard's words. "All you need is the right opportunity." The next day at school, Jamal couldn't keep the secret to himself. During lunch, he told his best friend, Marcus, about the SUV, the letter, and Mr. Howard's offer. "No way," Marcus said, his eyes wide. "You're telling me some rich dude just rolled up and offered to change your life?" "Pretty much," Jamal said, taking a bite of his sandwich. "That's insane," Marcus said, shaking his head. "You're lucky, man. If I were you, I'd say yes in a heartbeat." Jamal shrugged. "It's not that simple. My mom's worried it might be too good to be true." Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice. "Man, if someone's offering you a ticket out of this place, you take it. Who knows when you'll get another chance?" Jamal knew Marcus had a point, but it wasn't just about the money or the opportunities. Something about the whole situation still felt unsettled. Later that evening, as Jamal was helping Mia with her homework, the doorbell rang. His mom answered it, and Jamal heard familiar voices, those same suited men from before. His heart sank as they stepped into the living room. "Mrs. Carter," one of them began, his tone formal but firm. "Mr. Howard apologizes for the sudden interruption yesterday. He wishes to meet with you both tomorrow to discuss everything in detail." Jamal's mom raised an eyebrow. "He wants to meet me too." "Yes," the man said. "He understands your concerns and wants to assure you that his intentions are honorable." Jamal glanced at his mom, who looked unsure but nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "We'll hear him out." The men handed her a card with the meeting details and left as quickly as they had arrived. Jamal felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Tomorrow could be the day that changed everything, or it could bring more questions. The next morning, Jamal and his mom dressed in their best clothes. They weren't fancy, but they were clean and presentable. The same black SUV arrived to pick them up, and soon they were on their way back to Mr. Howard's estate. This time, Jamal felt more confident as they walked through the grand foyer. His mom, on the other hand, looked around with wide eyes, clearly impressed by the luxury but trying not to show it. Mr. Howard greeted them warmly, shaking both their hands. "Mrs. Carter, Jamal, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." They sat in the same cozy sitting room as before. Mr. Howard wasted no time, diving straight into his offer. He'd explained how he wanted to sponsor Jamal's education, covering everything from tuition to supplies. He even mentioned mentorship and future job opportunities. Jamal's mom listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about the logistics and legalities. Mr. Howard answered each one with patience and clarity. For the first time, she seemed to relax. "I'll be honest, Mr. Howard," she said. "This sounds amazing. But why go through all this trouble for a kid you just met?" Mr. Howard leaned forward, his expression sincere. "Because I see a lot of myself in Jamal. I know what it's like to grow up without resources, to feel like the odds are stacked against you. If someone hadn't helped me, I wouldn't be where I am today. I want to pay it forward." Jamal's mom nodded slowly, her skepticism softening. "It's a lot to think about." "Take all the time you need," Mr. Howard said. "There's no pressure. I just want to help." Just as the meeting seemed to be wrapping up, the butler entered again, his face pale. He whispered urgently into Mr. Howard's ear. This time, Mr. Howard's calm demeanor cracked. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. "I'm sorry," he said, standing abruptly. "I need to handle something. Please enjoy the refreshments while I'm gone." Before they could ask what was happening, Mr. Howard hurried out of the room. Jamal exchanged a worried glance with his mom. Something was definitely wrong. Minutes turned into an hour, The butler returned, apologizing for the delay but offering no explanation. Jamal could feel the tension building. Whatever was going on, it wasn't good. Finally, Mr. Howard reappeared, his face lined with stress. He sat down heavily and took a deep breath. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. "There's a situation I need to explain." Jamal and his mom leaned in, their curiosity and concern growing. "There's someone trying to sabotage my company," Mr. Howard continued, "and I have reason to believe they'll stop at nothing to ruin me." Jamal's mom frowned. "What does that have to do with us?" Mr. Howard hesitated before answering. "Because whoever it is, they've been watching you too." Jamal's heart stopped. "Watching us? Why?" Before Mr. Howard could answer, a loud bang echoed through the mansion. Jamal jumped, his pulse skyrocketing. The butler rushed in, his face as white as a sheet. "They're here," he whispered. Those words sent a chill through Jamal's entire body. His mom gasped, gripping his arm tightly. Mr. Howard's face turned grim as he stood up, his posture tense but composed. "Stay calm," he said, his voice low and steady. "Follow me." Quickly. Jamal and his mom exchanged panicked glances but obeyed, rising from their seats. Mr. Howard led them through a side door, down a long hallway, and into what looked like a private study. He locked the door behind them and activated a keypad hidden in the wall. A section of the bookshelf slid open, revealing a small hidden room. "In here," Mr. Howard said, motioning for them to step inside. Jamal hesitated. "What's going on? Who's after you?" "There's no time to explain everything right now," Mr. Howard replied. "But trust me, you're safer in here." His mom's voice shook. "You said someone's been watching us. Why? What did we do?" "You didn't do anything," Mr. Howard said, ushering them into the hidden room. "But whoever is targeting me thinks you're important to me, and they'll try to use that." The door to the study rattled as if someone was trying to open it. Jamal's mom quickly pulled him into the secret room, and Mr. Howard followed, pressing another button to close the entrance. They were plunged into darkness for a moment before a dim light flickered on. The hidden room was small, with just a table, a few chairs, and a monitor displaying security camera feeds. Jamal could see multiple angles of the mansion, including the front gate, hallways, and even the sitting room they had just left. On one of the screens, several men dressed in black tactical gear were moving through the house. They carried weapons, their faces covered by masks. Jamal's heart pounded. "Who are they?" "Mercenaries," Mr. Howard said grimly. "Hired to intimidate or worse. They've been trying to get to me for weeks." His mom's eyes widened. "And you brought us into this." "I didn't expect them to act this quickly," Mr. Howard admitted. "But I couldn't leave you unprotected. They know you helped me, and now they think you're involved." Jamal's mind raced. How had his life turned upside down so fast? Yesterday, he was just a kid helping someone with a flat tire. Now, he was hiding from armed men in a millionaire's mansion. The monitor showed the men moving closer to the study. One of them stopped and spoke into a radio. The others fanned out, searching. "What do we do if they find us?" Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Howard pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message. "We wait. Reinforcements are on the way." "Reinforcements?" Jamal's mom asked, her voice tight with fear. "You mean the police?" "Not exactly," Mr. Howard said, "but people I trust." Jamal's mom didn't look convinced, but there wasn't much time to argue. On the screen, one of the men reached the door to the study and tried the handle again. When it didn't budge, he stepped back and kicked it hard. The door held, but it wouldn't for long. "We have to move," Mr. Howard said. He pressed another button on the wall, and a panel in the floor slid open, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward. "Where does that go?" Jamal asked. "An underground tunnel," Mr. Howard explained. "It'll take us to a safe house a few blocks away." Jamal's mom hesitated. "You've had this planned all along?" Mr. Howard nodded. "I've made a lot of enemies over the years. This is my backup plan." The banging on the study door grew louder. Jamal's mom grabbed his hand. "Let's go." They hurried down the staircase, Mr. Howard leading the way. The tunnel was dimly lit, with rough stone walls and a low ceiling. Jamal's footsteps echoed as they moved quickly, his heart pounding with every step. After what felt like an eternity, they reached another door. Mr. Howard punched in a code, and it slid open to reveal a small, well-furnished room. It looked nothing like the cold tunnel they had just left. There was a sofa, a stocked kitchenette, and even a TV mounted on the wall. "Make yourselves comfortable," Mr. Howard said, locking the door behind them. "We'll be safe here for now." Jamal collapsed onto the sofa, his legs shaking. His mom sat beside him, still clutching his hand tightly. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. Mr. Howard walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a laptop. "We wait for my team to neutralize the threat. In the meantime, I'll monitor the situation." Jamal couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was like something out of an action movie, but it was real, and he was right in the middle of it. "Mr. Howard," Jamal said, "why would someone go through all this trouble just to hurt you?" Mr. Howard sighed, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. "Because I've been exposing corruption in high places. Some very powerful people want to shut me up." Jamal's mom frowned. "And you thought helping my son wouldn't put him in danger?" "I didn't anticipate this," Mr. Howard said, his expression serious. "But I'll do everything in my power to protect both of you." Before anyone could say more, the laptop screen lit up with a live feed from the mansion. The men in tactical gear were now retreating, their movements hurried. A new group of people had arrived, also armed but clearly better organized. "That's my team," Mr. Howard said, a hint of relief in his voice. Jamal leaned in to watch as Mr. Howard's security team efficiently cleared the mansion, subduing the intruders one by one. Within minutes, the threat seemed to be neutralized. "They're leaving," Mr. Howard said, pointing to the screen. The remaining intruders were being escorted out, their weapons confiscated. Jamal's mom exhaled deeply, thank God. But just as things seemed to calm down, an alert popped up on the screen. It showed a new vehicle approaching the estate, a black van with no plates. Mr. Howard's face darkened. "We're out of the woods yet." The black van sped down the long driveway toward the mansion, its windows as dark as the night sky. Jamal and his mom watched the screen in tense silence, their relief from moments ago replaced by a fresh wave of fear. "Who are they?" Jamal asked, his voice shaking. Mr. Howard narrowed his eyes. "I don't know yet, but whoever they are, they're not here for a friendly visit." On the monitor, Mr. Howard's security team sprang into action. They positioned themselves around the mansion, taking cover behind cars and garden walls, their weapons aimed at the van. The vehicle screeched to a stop near the front steps, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, the van's side door slid open. A man stepped out, dressed in a sleek black suit. Unlike the masked intruders from earlier, this man carried no visible weapons, but his presence was just as menacing. He walked with an air of authority, his hands clasped behind his back. Behind him, two more men emerged, each holding a small black briefcase. Mr. Howard leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tightening. "That's Victor Kane," he muttered, almost to himself. "Who's Victor Kane?" Jamal's mom asked. "He's one of the most dangerous men I've ever crossed," Mr. Howard said. "A powerful businessman with ties to organized crime. If he's here, things are worse than I thought." On the screen, Victor Kane stood calmly as one of Mr. Howard's security guards approached him. The two exchanged a few words, though the audio feed didn't pick them up. Then, without warning, Kane gestured toward his men. They opened their briefcases, revealing stacks of cash and what looked like confidential documents. Mr. Howard frowned. "He's trying to bargain." "Bargain for what?" Jamal asked. "For me to back off," Mr. Howard said. "Kane knows I have evidence that could ruin him. He's here to offer me a deal. Money in exchange for my silence." "Are you going to take it?" Jamal's mom asked, though the look on her face suggested she already knew the answer. "Absolutely not," Mr. Howard said firmly. "People like him rely on fear and bribery to stay in power. If I back down now, it'll only encourage more of this." Back on the screen, the security guard shook his head, clearly rejecting Kane's offer. Kane's calm demeanor didn't waver. Instead, he simply nodded and returned to the van. His men followed, closing the briefcases. As quickly as they had arrived, they were gone, the van speeding off into the night. Jamal let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's it. They just left." "For now," Mr. Howard said, though his tone was far from reassuring. "Kane doesn't give up that easily. He'll be back, and next time, he won't bother with negotiations." Jamal's mom rubbed her temples, clearly overwhelmed. "This is too much, Mr. Howard. You're putting my family in danger." "I understand your concern," Mr. Howard said, his voice gentle but resolute. "But I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. You have my word." Jamal's mom didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she pulled Jamal close, her protective instincts kicking in. "If anything happens to my son, I'll hold you responsible." Mr. Howard nodded solemnly. "Understood." The hours passed slowly. Jamal tried to distract himself by watching TV in the safe house's small living room, but his mind kept drifting back to the events of the day. His life had taken a dramatic turn in just 48 hours, and he wasn't sure how to process it all. Mr. Howard stayed glued to his laptop, monitoring the mansion and coordinating with his security team. Occasionally, he would step away to make phone calls, his voice low but urgent. Jamal's mom sat nearby, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked tired but determined, her eyes never leaving Jamal for long. "Mom," Jamal said quietly, breaking the silence, "do you think we'll ever go back to normal?" His mom sighed, brushing a hand over his head. "I don't know, baby, but whatever happens, we'll face it together." Jamal nodded, finding some comfort in her words. He leaned back on the sofa, his eyelids growing heavy. A loud alarm jolted Jamal awake. He sat up quickly, his heart racing. Mr. Howard was already on his feet, his laptop in hand. The screen showed flashing red alerts over the mansion's security feed. "They breached the perimeter," Mr. Howard said grimly. Jamal's mom stood, her face pale. "Who? Kane's men?" Mr. Howard nodded. "And they're not alone this time. They'd brought reinforcements." Jamal's pulse quickened as he watched the screen. More vehicles had arrived at the estate. 2 black SUVs and another van. Dozens of armed men were pouring out, their weapons gleaming under the security lights. Mr. Howard's security team moved to intercept them, but the intruders had already begun their assault. Gunfire erupted, the sound muted but unmistakable through the video feed. Jamal's mom clutched his arm. "We're not safe here, are we?" Mr. Howard shook his head. "The safe house will hold for now, but we need a new plan. They won't stop until they find us." Jamal swallowed hard, his mind racing. "What do we do?" Mr. Howard hesitated for a moment, then said, "We're going to outsmart them. But first, we need to move again." He opened a hidden compartment in the wall, revealing a set of backpacks. He handed one to Jamal and another to his mom. "Pack lightly," he instructed. "We'll be traveling fast." Jamal grabbed a few essentials, a change of clothes, his wallet, and a small notebook he always carried. His mom packed quickly as well, her hands shaking slightly. Mr. Howard pulled out a map and spread it on the table. "There's another safe location about 10 miles from here. We'll head there on foot to avoid detection." "On foot?" Jamal's mom asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "In the middle of the night?" "It's our best chance," Mr. Howard said. "The woods will give us cover, and my team will create a diversion to lead them away from us." Jamal felt a lump in his throat, but he nodded. He knew there was no other option. This was their fight for survival now. Just as they were about to leave, the monitor flickered, showing a new feed. One of the intruders had broken into the study and discovered the entrance to the tunnel. "They found the tunnel," Jamal said, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Howard's face hardened. "Then we need to go. Now." He led them to the back exit of the safe house, where a narrow path disappeared into the dense woods. The night was dark and silent, but Jamal could feel the weight of danger all around them. As they stepped into the shadows of the forest, a distant sound reached Jamal's ears, an ominous hum growing louder. He looked back and saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. "They're coming," he whispered. Mr. Howard didn't break stride. "Then we'll make sure they never catch us." The forest swallowed them whole, the towering trees casting shadows that seemed to move with the wind. Every step they took was muffled by the soft earth and fallen leaves, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The faint hum of engines grew louder, a persistent reminder that their pursuers weren't far behind. Mr. Howard led the way, his steps quick and purposeful. Jamal's mom kept a firm grip on his hand, her eyes darting nervously between the path ahead and the darkness behind them. "How much farther?" she whispered. "Not far," Mr. Howard replied, his voice steady but tense. "Once we reach the river, we'll be close." Jamal glanced over his shoulder, his heart racing. The headlights were now faint but visible, weaving through the trees like ghostly orbs. He could hear the faint crunch of tires over twigs and leaves. "They're following us," Jamal said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I know," Mr. Howard said, "but they won't catch us if we stick to the plan." The group pressed on, the sounds of the forest growing louder in the stillness of the night. The hoot of an owl echoed above, and the rustle of leaves hinted at unseen creatures moving in the underbrush. Jamal's grip tightened on his backpack straps, his palms sweaty despite the cool air. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing where the moonlight illuminated a shallow, fast-moving river. Mr. Howard stopped and turned to them. "We'll cross here," he said. "The water will help cover our tracks." Jamal's mom hesitated, her eyes flicking between the river and the approaching headlights. "Are you sure about this? It looks steep." "It's shallow enough to wade through," Mr. Howard assured her. "We'll be fine." Jamal didn't need any more convincing. He stepped into the water, shivering as the cold seeped through his shoes. His mom followed reluctantly, holding onto Jamal to keep her balance. Mr. Howard brought up the rear, keeping a vigilant eye on the trail behind them. As they made their way across, the headlights disappeared, replaced by the faint glow of flashlights bobbing through the trees. Jamal's heart pounded as he realized the men had abandoned their vehicles and were now on foot, closing in fast. "They're getting closer?" he whispered urgently. "Keep moving," Mr. Howard said, his tone unyielding. "We're almost there." They reached the opposite bank and scrambled up the slippery slope. Mr. Howard quickly led them back into the cover of the trees, his pace even faster now. The sound of rushing water and distant voices faded as they plunged deeper into the forest. Finally, they emerged into another clearing, this one smaller and surrounded by dense thickets. In the center stood a modest wooden cabin, almost invisible under the canopy of trees. "This is it," Mr. Howard said, pulling a key from his pocket. He had unlocked the door and ushered them inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished but functional. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the room. There was a small table, a couple of chairs, and a bed pushed against the far wall. "We'll be safe here for the night," Mr. Howard said, locking the door behind them. "My team will divert them away from this area." Jamal sank onto one of the chairs, his legs trembling from exhaustion. His mom sat beside him, her face pale and drawn. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mr. Howard set his backpack down and began unpacking a small laptop and a satellite phone. "Now we regroup. I'll check in with my team and get an update on the situation." Jamal's mom rubbed her temples, clearly struggling to process everything. "I just want my family to be safe," she said, her voice breaking. "And they will be," Mr. Howard said, his tone firm. "I promise." Jamal sat quietly, watching as Mr. Howard worked. The reality of their situation was sinking in. They were on the run from dangerous people, and there was no telling how long they'd have to keep moving. But at the same time, Jamal felt a strange sense of determination. He wasn't going to let fear control him. Hours passed in relative silence. Mr. Howard occasionally spoke into the satellite phone, his conversations short and coded. Jamal's mom dozed off on the bed, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. Jamal couldn't sleep. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and questions. He stared out the small window, watching the forest shift under the pale moonlight. Somewhere out there, men were hunting them, and the weight of that reality pressed heavily on his chest. Just as he began to doze off, a soft beat from Mr. Howard's laptop snapped him back to attention. Mr. Howard frowned as he read the screen. "What is it?" Jamal asked, his voice low. Mr. Howard didn't answer immediately. He clicked through several screens, his expression growing more serious by the second. "They've intercepted one of my security feeds," he said finally. "They know we're in this area." Jamal felt a surge of panic. "What do we do?" Mr. Howard closed the laptop and stood. "We need to leave. Now." Jamal quickly woke his mom, who'd sat up groggily. "What's happening?" "They're closing in on us," Mr. Howard said. "We have to move." Before they could gather their things, the sound of footsteps crunching on leaves echoed outside the cabin. Jamal froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, until they stopped just outside the door. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Then came the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps on the wooden door. Jamal's mom clutched his arm, her face pale with fear. Mr. Howard held a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Howard," a voice called from outside. It was smooth, almost friendly. "I know you're in there." Jamal's blood ran cold. It was the same voice he'd heard on the video feed earlier, Victor Kane. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Jamal's mom clung tightly to his arm, her grip trembling. Mr. Howard motioned for them to stay quiet as he moved toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate. "Mr. Howard," Victor Kane called again, his voice calm but laced with menace. "I'm not here to play games. We both know how this ends." Mr. Howard paused by the door, his hand hovering near the lock. He glanced back at Jamal and his mom, his expression unreadable. "Stay here," he whispered, "no matter what happens." Jamal wanted to protest, but his mom shook her head, her eyes pleading. He nodded reluctantly, his throat dry. Mr. Howard opened a small panel beside the door, revealing a hidden compartment. He pulled out a sleek black handgun and checked the chamber. Then, with a deep breath, he unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. Kane stood on the other side, his sharp features illuminated by the moonlight. He was flanked by two of his men, both holding weapons at their sides. Despite the danger, Kane's posture was relaxed, almost casual. "Evening," Kane said with a smirk. "Mind if we come in?" "You're not welcome here, Kane," Mr. Howard replied evenly. "Turn around and leave." Kane chuckled, shaking his head. "You always were stubborn, Robert, but I didn't come all this way to be turned away at the door." Mr. Howard tightened his grip on the doorframe. "I'm not giving you what you want." Kane's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can hide forever? You think your little secrets won't come to light? I have all the time in the world, but you—" he leaned in slightly. "You got a family to protect now." Mr. Howard didn't flinch. "You'll ever get to them." Kane raised an eyebrow. "You're betting their lives on that?" For a moment, neither man spoke. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Then, without warning, Kane stepped back and nodded to his men. They raised their weapons, aiming at the door. "Last chance," Kane said coldly. "Hand over the files or things get messy." Mr. Howard didn't respond. Instead, he slammed the door shut and bolted it. "Get down," he shouted, diving toward the table. Jamal and his mom barely had time to react before gunfire erupted, the cabin's wooden walls splintering as bullets tore through them. Jamal hit the floor, covering his head as his mom shielded him with her body. Mr. Howard crouched behind the table, returning fire through a gap in the wall. The sharp crack of gunshots echoed through the small space, each one sending a jolt of fear through Jamal. "We can't stay here," his mom shouted over the chaos. Mr. Howard nodded, his expression grim. "There's an escape hatch under the bed. Use it." Jamal scrambled to the bed, pulling it away from the wall with his mom's help. Sure enough, a small metal hatch was built into the floor. Mr. Howard tossed Jamal a key. "Open it and get moving," he said. "I'll cover you." Jamal's hands shook as he unlocked the hatch. It creaked open, revealing a dark tunnel below. His mom climbed in first, helping Jamal down after her. He turned back to look at Mr. Howard, who was still exchanging fire with Kane's men. "Come on," Jamal shouted. "I'll be right behind you," Mr. Howard called back. "Go." Reluctantly, Jamal slid into the tunnel, the cool air biting at his skin. His mom pulled him forward, her voice urgent. "We have to keep moving, Jamal." The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for them to crawl through. The sound of gunfire above was muffled but still audible, a constant reminder of the danger they were leaving behind. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as they moved deeper into the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel sloped upward, leading to another hatch. His mom pushed it open, revealing a small clearing surrounded by trees. They climbed out, gasping for air. "Where's Mr. Howard?" Jamal asked, looking back at the hatch. His mom shook her head, her eyes filled with worry. "He'll come. He has to." But minutes passed, and there was no sign of him. The sounds of gunfire had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Jamal's stomach twisted with fear. "We can't stay here," his mom said, her voice trembling. "We have to keep moving." Jamal hesitated, his eyes fixed on the hatch. "What if he needs our help?" "Jamal, please," his mom said, taking his hand. "We have to trust him. He told us to get to safety." Reluctantly, Jamal nodded. Together they moved away from the clearing, disappearing into the dense forest. The moonlight barely illuminated their path, but they kept going, driven by the need to put as much distance as possible between them and Kane's men. After several exhausting hours, they finally reached a road. Jamal's mom flagged down a passing car, a kind older couple who agreed to drive them to the nearest town. As they sat in the back seat, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of guilt and helplessness. "Do you think Mr. Howard is okay?" he asked quietly. His mom squeezed his hand. "He's a strong man, Jamal. If anyone can get out of that alive, it's him." Jamal nodded, but the knot in his stomach remained. He stared out the window, watching the trees blur past, his mind replaying the events of the night over and over. When they reached the town, the couple dropped them off at a small diner. They sat in a corner booth, trying to catch their breath and plan their next move. But just as Jamal took a sip of water, his mom's phone buzzed. She pulled it out and gasped when she saw the screen. "What is it?" Jamal asked. She showed him the message. It was from an unknown number, but the text was clear. "Jamal, you're not safe yet. Stay where you are. I'm coming." Before Jamal could react, the diner's door swung open, and a man stepped in. He wore a dark coat, his face partially hidden by a baseball cap. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Mr. Howard. It was one of Kane's men. Jamal froze, his grip tightening around the glass of water. Isman's eyes darted to the man in the baseball cap, her face pale. She leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't look at him. Stay calm." The man scanned the diner, his eyes sweeping over the booths like a predator searching for prey. Jamal's heart raced as he glanced around, searching for an escape route. The diner was small, with only one exit, the door the man had just walked through. The man walked slowly toward the counter, his movements deliberate. He exchanged a few words with the waitress, but his eyes kept flicking toward their booth. Jamal's mom reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "We'll wait for him to sit down," she whispered. "Then we'll head to the bathroom. There's usually a back exit in places like this." Jamal nodded, his throat too tight to speak. His eyes followed the man as he ordered a coffee and took a seat at the counter. He didn't seem in a rush, but Jamal knew better. He was waiting for something or someone. "Let's go," his mom said softly, sliding out of the booth. They stood, moving casually toward the hallway marked restrooms. Jamal felt the man's gaze on his back, but he didn't dare look. They pushed through the bathroom door and locked it behind them. "There's a way out," Jamal said, his voice trembling as he scanned the small, windowless room. His mom cursed under her breath, pacing in the tight space. "We'll have to wait him out. Maybe he didn't recognize us." A sharp knock on the bathroom door made them both jump. Jamal's mom pulled him close, her eyes wide with fear. "Occupied," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. Another knock, louder this time. Then the man's voice came through the door, calm but firm. "Mrs. Carter, Jamal, I know you're in there." Jamal's blood turned cold. His mom backed up against the sink, her hands gripping the edge. "You got the wrong people," she said, her voice shaking. The man chuckled. "Come on now. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. Mr. Kane just wants to talk." "Leave us alone," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking. The man sighed. "Look, kid, I've got all night. But if you don't open this door, I can't promise things will go easy on you." Jamal looked at his mom, panic rising. "What do we do?" His mom opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a sudden crash echoed from the front of the diner. Shouts followed, and then the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. "Police, get on the ground," a voice bellowed. Jamal's eyes widened. "What's happening?" His mom motioned for him to stay quiet. They listened as the diner erupted into chaos, orders being barked, the sound of heavy boots on tile, and the thud of bodies hitting the floor. The man outside their door cursed loudly. "They're here," he muttered, followed by the sound of him retreating. A few tense moments passed before another knock came on the bathroom door, this one lighter. "Mrs. Carter?" "Jamal, it's safe now." Jamal's mom hesitated. "Who's there?" "Agent Reynolds, FBI," the voice said. "We've been working with Mr. Howard. You're safe." Jamal's mom glanced at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Finally, she unlocked the door. A tall man in a navy blue jacket stood there, flashing a badge. Behind him, several agents were handcuffing Kane's man and escorting him out of the diner. "Are you okay?" Agent Reynolds asked, his tone serious but kind. Jamal nodded, his legs still shaking. "What's going on? Where's Mr. Howard?" Agent Reynolds motioned for them to follow him. "Mr. Howard is fine. He sent us to get you. We've been tracking Kane's men for weeks, and we finally got a break tonight." As they stepped out of the bathroom, Jamal saw the aftermath of the raid. Broken glass littered the floor, and several patrons were huddled in the corner, being questioned by agents. The man in the baseball cap was being led out in handcuffs, his face expressionless. Agent Reynolds guided them to a waiting black SUV. "We're taking you to a secure location," he said as they climbed in. "Mr. Howard will meet us there." The drive was tense, but the presence of the agents gave Jamal a small sense of relief. His mom held his hand tightly, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. They arrived at a secluded building surrounded by trees. More agents were stationed outside, their eyes scanning the perimeter. Inside, they were led to a conference room where Mr. Howard was waiting. Jamal's heart lifted when he saw him. "Mr. Howard," he said, running over. Mr. Howard smiled, his face showing signs of exhaustion but relief. "You made it." Jamal's mom wasn't as quick to forgive. "You've got some explaining to do," she said, her tone sharp. "We've been running for our lives, and my son nearly got killed tonight." Mr. Howard nodded, his expression serious. "You're right, and I'm sorry for everything you've been through. But I couldn't risk Kane getting to you." Jamal's mom crossed her arms. Why is he so interested in my family? Mr. Howard sighed. Kane thinks you have something valuable, something I've hidden. He believes I entrusted it to you. But we don't have anything, Jamal said, confused. I don't, Mr. Howard said. But Kane doesn't. As long as he believes you're connected to me, you'll be a target. Jamal's mom shook her head in disbelief. So what do we do now? Keep running forever? No, Mr. Howard said firmly. We're going to end this. Jamal looked at him, his heart pounding. How? Mr. Howard leaned forward, his eyes filled with determination. We're going to expose Kane and his entire operation, and we're going to do it together. Jamal's mom stared at Mr. Howard, her expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. Expose Kane? Are you serious? My son and I are not spies or law enforcement. We're just a family trying to survive. Mr. Howard nodded solemnly. I understand, Mrs. Carter. But Kane's operation goes deeper than you think. If we don't stop him now, he'll continue to hurt innocent people, and he won't stop coming after you. Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. But how are we supposed to help? We don't have any of the things he's looking for. Mr. Howard leaned back, his hands clasped tightly. That's exactly why you're important. Kane believes you're holding on to something critical, and that gives us leverage. Jamal's mom shook her head. Leverage? You're asking us to put ourselves in even more danger. I'm asking for your trust, Mr. Howard said, his voice steady but urgent. I have a plan, but I can't do it without you. Jamal glanced at his mom, then back at Mr. Howard. What kind of plan? Mr. Howard hesitated for a moment before pulling out a folder from his briefcase. He spread the contents across the table, maps, photos, and documents with confidential markings. This, he said, pointing to a blueprint, is one of Kane's safe houses. It's where he stores critical information about his operations, financial records, client lists, blackmail material. Jamal's mom frowned. And how does that help us? Kane doesn't know we've identified this location, Mr. Howard explained. If we can get inside and retrieve those files, we'll have enough evidence to dismantle his entire network. Jamal's eyes widened. You want us to break into his safe house? Not you directly, Mr. Howard said quickly. I have a team for that, but I need you to help draw Kane's attention elsewhere. If he thinks you are still holding onto the files he's looking for, he'll focus all his efforts on finding you. Jamal's mom slammed her hand on the table. You want to use us as bait? Not without protection, Mr. Howard said. You'll be under constant surveillance, with agents nearby at all times. The moment there's any sign of trouble, they'll intervene. Jamal's mom stood, pacing the room. This is insane. You're asking us to risk everything. I'm asking you to help end this nightmare, Mr. Howard said, his voice soft but firm. For your safety, for your son's future, and for all the people Kane has hurt. The room fell silent. Jamal could see the conflict in his mom's eyes. She wanted to protect him, to shield him from danger, but she also understood the weight of what Mr. Howard was saying. Finally, she turned to Jamal. What do you think, baby? This affects you too. Jamal swallowed hard. His mind was racing, but one thought stood out. They couldn't keep running forever. If there was a chance to stop Kane and reclaim their lives, maybe it was worth the risk. I think we should do it, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. But only if we stick together. His mom took a deep breath, then nodded reluctantly. All right, but if anything happens to my son, Mr. Howard, I'll hold you personally responsible. Mr. Howard nodded. Understood. The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparation. Mr. Howard's team outfitted Jamal and his mom with discreet tracking devices and gave them a crash course on what to do if things went south. Jamal tried to absorb everything, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. By nightfall, they were ready. The plan was simple but dangerous. Jamal and his mom would return to their house as if nothing had happened, drawing Kane's attention. Meanwhile, Mr. Howard's team would infiltrate the safe house and retrieve the evidence. As they drove back to their neighborhood, the tension in the car was palpable. Jamal stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur past. It felt surreal to be heading back home, knowing they were walking into a trap. When they pulled up to their house, an unmarked van was parked discreetly nearby, filled with agents ready to spring into action. Jamal's mom squeezed his hand as they stepped out of the car. Stay close, she said, her voice trembling. They entered the house, and for a moment, everything felt normal. The familiar smell of home, the worn furniture, even the soft hum of the fridge. It was as if the past few days had been a bad dream. But Jamal knew better. He could feel the eyes on them, the invisible threat looming just beyond the walls. Hours passed and nothing happened. Jamal and his mom tried to act natural, cooking dinner and watching TV, but the tension was unbearable. Every sound made them jump, every shadow seemed to hide danger. Just as Jamal was beginning to think Kane wasn't coming, the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. Jamal's mom grabbed his arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay calm." A second later, the front door burst open. Jamal's heart leaped as heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Flashlights swept through the darkness, and the cold, menacing voice of Victor Kane filled the air. "Mrs. Carter, Jamal," he called out, his tone mocking. "I know you're here. Let's not play hide and seek." Jamal's mom pulled him toward the kitchen, where a back door led to the yard. But before they could reach it, a flashlight beam caught them. "There you are," one of Kane's men said, raising his weapon. Jamal's mom shielded him with her body. "Stay back," she shouted. Kane's voice came from behind the man. "Ah, there's no need for dramatics. We just want to talk." Mr. Howard's promise of protection echoed in Jamal's mind. But where were the agents? Why hadn't they intervened? Kane stepped forward, his flashlight illuminating his sharp features. He smiled coldly. "Now, let's have a little chat about those files." Before Jamal or his mom could respond, the sound of shattering glass came from the living room. The agents were finally making their move. "Get down," someone shouted. Jamal hit the floor as chaos erupted around him. Gunfire, shouting, and the thud of heavy boots filled the house. He clung to his mom, his heart pounding as the battle raged on. Amid the chaos, Kane locked eyes with Jamal. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. "You're more trouble than you're worth, kid," Kane snarled. Then, without warning, he pulled something from his coat, a small device with a blinking red light. Jamal's eyes widened in horror. "Bomb!" one of the agents shouted. Kane threw the device toward the kitchen, its ominous beat growing faster. Jamal's mom screamed, pulling him toward the back door as the agents lunged to contain the blast. But they were out of time. The explosion rocked the house, sending Jamal and his mom flying into the yard. The world spun around him as he hit the ground, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. Through the haze, Jamal saw the house engulfed in flames and the dark figure of Kane slipping away into the night. Jamal struggled to push himself up from the ground, his ears ringing from the explosion. His mom lay a few feet away, coughing and trying to catch her breath. Flames licked at the edges of the house, casting an eerie glow over the yard. "Mom!" Jamal crawled toward her, his heart pounding. "Are you okay?" She nodded weakly, clutching his arm as he helped her sit up. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaky. "Are you hurt?" Jamal shook his head, though his entire body ached. Before he could say more, the sound of footsteps snapped him back to the present. Agents rushed into the yard, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Jamal, Mrs. Carter." Agent Reynolds appeared, his face grim but relieved. "We've got you." He helped them to their feet, guiding them toward the van parked nearby. Jamal glanced back at the burning house, his stomach twisting. The place he'd called home was gone, reduced to rubble in an instant. "What about Kane?" Jamal asked as they reached the van. "Did you get him?" Agent Reynolds shook his head. "He slipped away in the chaos, but we'll find him. He won't get far." Jamal clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything Kane had taken from them. Their safety, their peace of mind, their freedom. As they climbed into the van, Mr. Howard appeared, his face streaked with soot and his suit torn. Despite his disheveled appearance, his eyes burned with determination. "Are you both all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Jamal's mom nodded, though her expression was strained. "We're fine. But we can't keep living like this, Mr. Howard." "I know," he said, his tone serious. "And I promise you, this ends tonight." Jamal frowned. "What do you mean?" Mr. Howard leaned in, his voice low. "We have what we need. My team retrieved the files from Kane's safe house while he was focused on you. We're taking the fight to him now." Jamal's mom's eyes widened. "You're going after him directly." Mr. Howard nodded. "We know where he's hiding. This is our chance to put an end to his operation for good." Jamal's heart raced. Part of him was terrified, but another part, a braver, angrier part, wanted to see this through. "Take us with you," Jamal said, surprising even himself. His mom gasped. "Jamal, no, it's too dangerous." "I know," Jamal said, meeting her gaze. "But we've come this far. I don't want to run anymore." Mr. Howard placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You already done more than enough, Jamal. But if you want to be there, I won't stop you." Jamal's mom hesitated, then reluctantly nodded. Fine, but if anything happens to him, it won't, Mr. Howard said firmly. The van sped through the dark streets, heading toward an industrial area on the outskirts of town. Mr. Howard's team briefed them on the plan. Kane was holed up in an abandoned warehouse, guarded by a handful of his men. The goal was to capture him and secure the remaining evidence of his crimes. As they approached the warehouse, Jamal's stomach churned with anticipation. He could see the faint outline of the building in the distance, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. The van came to a stop a few blocks away, and the team prepared to move in. "Stay close to me," Mr. Howard said, handing Jamal and his mom bulletproof vests. "We'll keep you safe." They exited the van, the cool night air prickling Jamal's skin. The agents moved silently, their weapons at the ready. Jamal stayed close to his mom, his heart pounding with every step. When they reached the warehouse, Mr. Howard signaled for the team to fan out. Jamal and his mom stayed near the back, watching as the agents positioned themselves around the building. Suddenly, a loud bang shattered the silence. One of the agents had breached the front door, and the team poured inside. Shots and gunfire echoed through the warehouse as the operation began. Jamal's mom grabbed his hand, pulling him behind a stack of crates for cover. "Stay down," she whispered. Jamal peeked around the corner, his adrenaline spiking. He could see the agents engaging with Kane's men, their movements swift and coordinated. Mr. Howard was at the center of it all, directing the team with precision. Then, amidst the chaos, Jamal spotted Kane. The man was standing on an elevated platform at the far end of the warehouse, his face twisted with rage. He barked orders to his men, but it was clear he was losing control. Jamal's fists clenched. "There he is," he whispered. Mr. Howard seemed to notice him too. He signaled to the team, and a group of agents moved toward the platform, cutting off Kane's escape routes. Kane pulled a gun, firing wildly, but the agents pressed forward. Realizing he was outmatched, Kane turned and bolted toward a side exit. Jamal's heart leaped. "He's getting away." Mr. Howard reacted instantly. "Stay here," he shouted, chasing after Kane. Jamal couldn't just sit back. Ignoring his mom's protests, he followed Mr. Howard, determination driving him forward. He burst through the side door into an alleyway, just in time to see Mr. Howard and Kane locked in a fierce struggle. Kane swung wildly, but Mr. Howard ducked and landed a solid punch to his gut. Kane staggered, but before Mr. Howard could restrain him, Kane pulled a knife from his belt. "Howard," Jamal yelled, grabbing a loose pipe from the ground. Kane lunged, the blade aimed at Mr. Howard's chest. Without thinking, Jamal rushed forward, swinging the pipe with all his strength. It struck Kane's arm, knocking the knife from his grasp. Kane cried out, stumbling backward. Mr. Howard seized the opportunity, tackling him to the ground and pinning him down. "Nice timing, Jamal," Mr. Howard said, slightly out of breath. Jamal nodded, his hands shaking. "I wasn't going to let him hurt you." Sirens wailed in the distance as more agents arrived, securing the area. Kane was handcuffed and hauled to his feet, his face contorted with fury. "This isn't over," he spat, glaring at Mr. Howard and Jamal. "You'll regret this." Mr. Howard didn't flinch. "No, Kane. You're the one who's done." As Kane was led away, Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was finally over. Kane was caught, and they were safe. For the first time in days, Jamal allowed himself to breathe. Jamal sat on the curb outside the warehouse, his legs trembling from the adrenaline. His mom rushed over, pulling him into a tight hug. Her hands roamed his face and arms, checking for injuries. "Are you okay? What were you thinking?" she asked, her voice a mixture of relief and frustration. "I'm fine, Mom," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the chaos still ringing in his ears. "I couldn't just let him hurt Mr. Howard." She sighed, holding him close. "You scared me to death, Jamal." Mr. Howard approached, his face tired but full of gratitude. "You did well, Jamal. You were brave, recklessly so, but brave." Jamal's mom shot him a stern look. "That's one word for it. He's still a kid." Mr. Howard nodded. "You're right, Mrs. Carter, and I'm sorry you both were put in this position. But thanks to you, we've taken down a dangerous man." Jamal looked past Mr. Howard to where Kane was being loaded into the back of a police van. His eyes locked with Kane's for a moment, and a chill ran down Jamal's spine. Even in handcuffs, Kane's glare was filled with malice. "He's not going to get out of this, right?" Jamal asked, his voice quieter. Mr. Howard shook his head. "Not this time. With the evidence we gathered, Kane will be facing charges that even his connections can't save him from. His empire is crumbling." Jamal felt the weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in days, he believed they could finally put this nightmare behind them. The next few days passed in a blur of debriefings and media coverage. Kane's arrest was headline news, and the details of his crimes shocked the nation. Fraud, extortion, and a web of corruption that reached into some of the most powerful circles. Thanks to Mr. Howard and his team, the authorities now had the evidence to bring it all crashing down. Jamal and his mom were relocated to a temporary safe house while their old neighborhood was being secured. It was a modest apartment, but it felt like a palace compared to the tension and fear they'd been living under. One evening, as they settled in for dinner, there was a knock at the door. Jamal's mom tensed, but when she peeked through the peephole, she relaxed. "It's Mr. Howard," she said, opening the door. Mr. Howard stepped inside, carrying a small box under his arm. He smiled warmly. "I thought I'd stop by and check on you both." "We're doing okay," Jamal's mom said. "Thanks to you." Mr. Howard nodded, then turned to Jamal. "I have something for you." He handed Jamal the box. Confused, Jamal opened it to find a sleek new laptop inside, along with a few other gadgets. "This is incredible," Jamal said, his eyes lighting up. "But why?" Mr. Howard smiled. "You've shown a lot of potential, Jamal. I want to make sure you have the tools to pursue your dreams, whatever they may be. Whether it's school, technology, or something else entirely, I'll be here to support you." Jamal's mom looked at Mr. Howard, her eyes softening. "You've already done so much for us. We can't thank you enough." Mr. Howard waved her off. "You don't need to thank me. You've earned this." They spent the evening talking, laughing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, enjoying a sense of normalcy. Jamal felt a spark of hope ignite within him. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like a future he could look forward to. As the night wore on, Mr. Howard prepared to leave. He shook Jamal's hand firmly, then turned to his mom. "Take care of each other," he said, "and remember, you're not alone in this." Jamal nodded. "Thanks, Mr. Howard, for everything." Mr. Howard smiled one last time before stepping out into the night. Jamal watched him go, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they had survived, and together they could face whatever came next. But as Jamal closed the door, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. Kane was behind bars, but his final words echoed in Jamal's ears. "This isn't over." Jamal couldn't help but wonder if Kane had been telling the truth, and if so, what would come next? The days stretched into weeks, and life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Jamal returned to school, where he was greeted like a hero. News of his role in taking down one of the country's most dangerous criminals had spread, though most people only knew the surface details. To his classmates, Jamal was the brave kid who helped a millionaire and ended up in the middle of a crime saga. At home, his mom was working with lawyers to handle the rebuilding of their lives. With the compensation offered by Mr. Howard, they were in a better position than ever before. They'd planned to move into a safer neighborhood once things fully calmed down. But even with the world seemingly moving on, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that Kane's words were more than a hollow threat. One evening, as Jamal worked on a school project using the laptop Mr. Howard had given him, his screen flickered. A message popped up, seemingly out of nowhere. "Nice laptop, Jamal. Hope you're enjoying it." Jamal's heart stopped. He stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The message was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Mom," he called out, his voice shaky. His mom rushed into the room. "What's wrong?" Jamal pointed at the laptop. "Someone just sent me a message, but it disappeared." She frowned, her protective instincts immediately kicking in. "Are you sure? Could it have been a glitch?" Before Jamal could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up hesitantly, his heart racing as he saw the message. "Thought you'd gotten rid of me." It was from an unknown number. Jamal showed his mom, and her face turned pale. "Call Mr. Howard," she said urgently. Jamal dialed the number he had memorized, his hands shaking. Mr. Howard answered on the second ring. "Jamal, is everything okay?" "No," Jamal said, his voice trembling. "I just got a message from someone. I think it's Kane." There was a pause on the line before Mr. Howard spoke, his tone calm but serious. "Stay where you are. I'm sending a team over now." Within minutes, agents arrived at the apartment, securing the perimeter and checking their devices. Jamal sat on the couch, his mom beside him, as Mr. Howard arrived. He knelt in front of Jamal, his expression grave. "Tell me exactly what happened." Jamal recounted the strange message on his laptop and the text on his phone. Mr. Howard nodded, his face unreadable. "It's possible Kane left behind some loyal people who are trying to intimidate you," he said. "We'll trace the messages and find out who's behind this." Jamal's mom folded her arms tightly. "I thought this was over, Mr. Howard. You promised we'd be safe." "And you are," Mr. Howard said firmly. "We're not going to let anything happen to you." But Kane's network was vast. Even though he's behind bars, it'll take time to dismantle every piece. Jamal's mind raced. "Do you think it's someone working for him?" "Possibly," Mr. Howard said, "but we'll know more soon." That night, Jamal barely slept. Every sound, every creak of the apartment seemed amplified in the darkness. His mind kept returning to the message, the way it seemed to taunt him. Was Kane still pulling strings from his prison cell? And if so, what was his endgame? The next morning, Mr. Howard returned with news. "We traced the messages to a device near the prison where Kane is being held," he said. "Someone's trying to send a message, not just to you, but to everyone involved in his arrest." Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. "What does that mean?" "It means Kane is still trying to hold on to power," Mr. Howard said. "But we've already intercepted his communications. He's not as untouchable as he thinks." Jamal's mom frowned. "So what do we do now?" Mr. Howard gave them a reassuring smile. "We keep living our lives. My team will handle the rest. You've done your part, and you deserve to move on." Jamal wanted to believe him, but the unease lingered. Still he nodded, knowing that they were in good hands. Over the next few weeks, things began to settle again. The strange messages stopped, and Jamal started to feel like a normal kid. His grades improved, and he even joined the school's debate team, finding a new passion in speaking up for himself and others. One afternoon, as he and his mom unpacked boxes in their new home, his phone buzzed. He picked it up, half expecting another cryptic message, but instead, it was a simple text from Mr. Howard. "All clear. You're safe now." Jamal showed the message to his mom, and for the first time in weeks, they both smiled. That night, as Jamal lay in bed, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The nightmare was finally over, and though the scars of the past few months would remain, he knew they were stronger for it. Before he drifted off to sleep, a thought crossed his mind. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stand up, even when you're scared. And in doing so, you can change your life, and maybe even the world around you. In the weeks that followed, the final pieces of Kane's empire unraveled. Mr. Howard's team worked tirelessly with federal authorities, combing through the mountain of evidence they had collected. One by one, Kane's associates were arrested, their illicit dealings exposed to the world to see. The media dubbed it the fall of the empire, and it dominated headlines for months. Kane, despite his confident threats, found himself isolated. His trial was swift and decisive, thanks to the overwhelming evidence and testimony from former allies eager to save themselves. He was convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. The judge sentenced him to life in a maximum security prison, without the possibility of parole. Jamal watched the verdict live on TV, sitting beside his mom. The sight of Kane being led away in handcuffs brought a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. "It's over," Jamal's mom said softly, tears in her eyes. "We're finally free." Jamal nodded, the weight of the past few months lifting off his shoulders. For the first time, he felt like he could breathe again. A few weeks later, Mr. Howard invited Jamal and his mom to a private ceremony at his estate. They arrived to find a small gathering of people, agents, lawyers, and others who had played crucial roles in bringing Kane to justice. Mr. Howard stood at the front of the room, addressing the group. "Today, we celebrate the courage and resilience of everyone who helped take down one of the most dangerous men in the country. But I want to take a moment to recognize two individuals who showed extraordinary bravery." He turned to Jamal and his mom. "Jamal Carter and Mrs. Carter, you risked everything to do the right thing. Without your help, this victory wouldn't have been possible." The room erupted in applause as Mr. Howard handed Jamal a plaque engraved with his name. Jamal's mom received a similar one, her eyes shining with pride. "You've earned this," Mr. Howard said, shaking their hands. "And as promised, I'll continue to support you in any way I can." After the ceremony, Mr. Howard pulled Jamal aside. "I've been thinking about your future, Jamal. You've shown a natural talent for problem-solving and leadership. If you're interested, I'd like to mentor you personally." Jamal's eyes widened. "Really? You think I could do something like this?" Mr. Howard smiled. "Absolutely. With the right guidance, you can achieve anything." Jamal nodded, feeling a spark of excitement. "I'd love that." Life for the Carters improved dramatically. With Mr. Howard's help, Jamal's mom was able to secure a job at a reputable accounting firm, one that valued her skills and provided a steady income. They'd moved into a new home in a safer neighborhood, surrounded by supportive neighbors and friends. Jamal thrived under Mr. Howard's mentorship, excelling in school and exploring his interests in technology and leadership. He even started a community program to teach younger kids about standing up for what's right, sharing his story as a way to inspire others. As for Kane, he spent the rest of his days behind bars, his power and influence reduced to nothing. The world moved on, but the legacy of his downfall served as a cautionary tale for those who thought they were untouchable. One evening, as Jamal and his mom sat on their porch watching the sunset, his mom turned to him with a smile. "You've grown so much, Jamal," she said. "I'm so proud of you." Jamal smiled back. "We did this together, Mom. We made it through." As the sky turned shades of orange and purple, Jamal felt a deep sense of peace. The road had been long and filled with challenges, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever the future held. And for the first time in a long time, life felt like it was truly theirs to live.